morning, good afternoon, good evening. Well, hello, Baloo. Come here, buddy. You want to come up here? Come on, come on. Yes, yes. This is Baloo. I know a lot of you seen him before. Rescue dog, right? Yes, you little baby. And Maddie, come here, Maddie. All right, come here. All right, I know. Can't be left out. Ugh! Maddie's also a rescue dog. She was she was dropped off at the shelter. I guess her eye had been injured, and they had to end up taking her left eye out. But she sees pretty well, a lot better than I think maybe a lot of people in our world these days, huh? Yeah. Anyway, life doesn't get a heck of a lot better than this. Having, two creatures of God who love you unconditionally. I know I'm being anthropomorphic. I'm projecting human feelings and emotions onto them, but you know what? Oh well. I want to speak to. I'm wearing my glasses. I'm all over the place at the moment. And it's a little vessel in the corner of my eye keeps bursting or something. I don't know. But anyway, so contacts are just going to be too uncomfortable today. I want to speak to something that's in the air and is there, and it's intriguing, disconcerting, fascinating, and I don't know where you stand on it, but I see it taking a hold more and more in the way people perceive and think and how they respond and act to matters within society. It has to do with conspiracy, the QAnon conspiracy. Google it, QAnon. Anyway, if you're not familiar with it. But the enthusiasts believe that President Trump is secretly combating a global cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles. And they have this shared passion for, these pedophiles do, for ritual baby sacrifice. And it's this battle, I think, more so than the battle really between Republicans and Democrats, I think that will determine the future of the Republic in so many ways. This whole concept of how these conspiracies take hold. QAnon devotees anticipate a coming storm, if you will, when President Trump will round up and imprison and expose the enemies of America. My response to that is, okay. You can respond however you want, but I'm like, millions of voters have never heard of QAnon, yet are nevertheless convinced that George Soros secretly controls Washington politics, or that the COVID-19 pandemic is a liberal hoax. Ask many of these people if Barack Obama is an American citizen or even a Christian, and you'll typically hear an emphatic no. Okay. That is, it's got to be, we cannot ignore it, and I can't remain silent about it because it impacts too many people in our society. Okay. Sidney Powell, one of the attorneys, is making allegations of, massive voter fraud. I mean, you have Texas questioning the votes of 4 other states right now. My response is, once again, it's like, okay. I'm at loss of words. My response is, I think people just stop thinking. Are Christians, I mean, a lot of them are Christians, the vast majority are. I mean, are we just like molded to buy into conspiracy? I mean, do we live a certain belief system that enables us to be, buying into these ideas? Does our faith enable us to do that? I don't know. But, Sidney Powell is convinced that communist money is being used, and there's this sinister computer algorithm out there that is combined to steal the 2020 presidential election. Powell's legal claims may be failing miserably in the courts, and to date, the Supreme Court doesn't want to hear anything to do with it. But such thinking is, by Sidney Powell, is greatly welcomed by the QAnon community and is seen like gospel. According to a recent poll, and some polls are all over the place, whatever. But I saw like 3% of people who voted for President Trump believe that, do not believe that, where only 3% believe that Joe Biden won the election. That's pretty stunning. Like, wow, if you really believe he didn't, if Biden stole the election, you've got to be really upset. My heart goes out to you. I mean, it really does. There's nothing new about conspiracy theories. Recently, while doing some reading on the history of Black America, particularly on lynching, I learned a story that I was not familiar with. Maybe you are. And this all has to do with conspiracy. I learned about the story of Anthony Bewley, a Methodist minister who was lynched in Fort Worth, Texas. This was back in 1860. Bewley was the victim of a bizarre conspiracy theory. His troubles began back in 1844, as the story goes, when the Methodist Episcopal Church divided over the issue of slavery. And a resolution was passed by the Southern churches that explained that, and basically these are the words: we regard the officious and unwarranted interference of the northern portion of the church with the subject of slavery alone a sufficient cause for the division of our church. We are going to separate, basically, they're saying, from our northern brothers and sisters in the church because they're standing for the abolition of slavery. Bewley's presence in North Texas was deeply resented by Southern Methodists. Texas was a slave state back then, and Bewley was affiliated with the abolitionist Northern Methodist. A minister who's like a fish out of water. Imagine. Bewley was a circuit preacher, ministering to 232 people in 6 sparsely populated counties. And he generally avoided the hot topic of slavery, but everyone knew where he stood. In 1860, the year that Bewley was lynched, 2/3 of Texas residents were from somewhere else. Many were from free states. And pro-union sentiment was strong the year he was lynched. A year earlier, Sam Houston, running on a unionist platform, had been elected governor, having brought Texas into the Union, running on that unionist platform. So here he is, brought into Texas, into the Union in 1846. This was 2 years after the Methodists split. the Northern and Southern Methodists. Houston regarded talk of the Southern Confederacy with suspicion. In this political environment, Bewley's abolitionist sentiments were tolerated. Okay. But when John Brown raided Harper's Ferry and the Republicans selected Abraham Lincoln as their presidential nominee, the tide began to turn. And Bewley knew he was living in a different world when he learned that Solomon McKinney and Parson Blunt, two itinerant preachers from Iowa, had been run out of Dallas and the state of Texas for airing their anti-slavery views. Bewley's fledgling band of Methodist churches held their annual conference in 1860, July of 1860, and the attendees sensed that something was afoot when two Southern Methodist ministers joined the gathering. One of those visitors reported to the local committee of vigilance, if you will, that a member of Bewley's group had sought to influence a local Negro by reading to him, after which the slave became useless to his owner. That was in that member's words. In his testimony before the committee, the man apologized for incriminating any white man, even a suspected abolitionist, by the testimony of this Negro. Bewley and his followers were commanded to discontinue their activities forthwith. As the situation deteriorated, Bewley gathered his family and they fled to Missouri. Shortly after his departure, a general store in Dallas caught fire. Every business in the downtown area was reduced to ashes. In the coming days, fires were reported in nearby Denton and several other North Texas communities. The area was in the grip of a terrible drought. The temperature had soared to 110 degrees in Dallas the day of the fire. Historians now speculate that the phosphorus matches that were newly introduced into the region spontaneously ignited in the extreme heat. But in the eyes of Charles R. Pryor, a Dallas physician who recently had inherited the Dallas Herald, the newspaper, he said the multiple fires were no coincidence. Thus begins this conspiracy. His printing press was destroyed in that Dallas inferno, and Pryor fired off handwritten letters to every pro-slavery newspaper in Texas, detailing a ghastly conspiracy. With each letter, he wrote the scope of the conspiracy grew. A letter from Dallas, read the headlines in the Houston Telegraph. And subtitle, a most diabolical plot, unheard of scoundrelism. What a great word, scoundrelism. Pryor blamed the fires on abolition preachers who were actuated by a fiendish malignity of spirit. And these preachers returned by stealth and planned to wreak their vengeance upon the offending communities, quote unquote. Within days, Pryor had convinced himself that emissaries throughout the state, using vast financial resources provided by the Abolition Aid Society of the North, had hatched a well-digested plan which by fire and assassination will finally render life and property insecure, and the slave by constant rebellion a curse to the master. These abolitionist ministers, oh, the plot they have woven, right? Whipped into a frenzy by Charles Pryor's words, the Dallas Community of Vigilance quickly rounded up 100 black slaves, whipping them mercilessly until they told the story the committee wanted to hear. Pryor soon was reporting that the three ringleaders, Sam Smith, an old Negro preacher, and two men identified only by their Christian names, Cato and Patrick, were escorted from the jail to the place of execution. Pastor Smith, Pryor reported, had imbibed most of his villainous principles from Blunt and McKinney. A few days later, the body of William H. Crawford, a white resident with abolitionist sympathies, was found suspended from a pecan tree about 3/4 of a mile from Fort Worth. According to Pryor's report, a large number of persons visited the body during the day. A hastily formed committee of vigilance endorsed the action of the party, who hung him. Days later, an incriminating letter was found near Bewley's home. A scheming abolitionist named William H. Bailey discussed the details of a massive plot to spark a slave revolt throughout Texas using poison, arson, and assassination. A $1,000 reward was issued for the arrest of Bewley, which would be like more than $30,000 in our day. And it wasn't long before a committee of vigilance in Fayette, Arkansas, located the refugee preacher Bewley in Missouri. One moment. Gotta get someone here real quick. Be right back. Wait, guys. Oops. Sorry about that. I had to get someone at the door there, and this being a longer devotion, interruptions happen. It's all good. Anyway, back to them locating Bewley in Missouri. And I'm winding it up here. Bewley was, they located him, stuffed him into a stagecoach under armed guard, and turned him over to the authorities in Fort Worth, Texas. He told the Committee of Vigilance that he had nothing to say to them. He knew that anything he said wouldn't make any difference anyway. And before he could even have a trial, a mob came and they hung him. Yep, before he could have his day in court. They dragged him to the same pecan tree, or pecan tree where William H. Crawford had been lynched 2 weeks earlier. Strung him up. Bewley's lifeless corpse swung there for 2 days and apparently was visited by a lot of people. After those 2 days, some slaves were dispatched to cut him down, and he was buried in a shallow grave. Then his body was exhumed, the flesh was taken off the bones, and his skeleton was draped over Ephraim Daggett's storehouse, where school children were encouraged to play with the bones. Now, I know people get upset with me, but yikes. In the next few months, after Bewley's death, more than 100 persons, black and white, who were connected with Pryor's conspiracy theory were arrested and lynched. On February 2nd, 1861, Texas threw in its lot with the Confederacy. And this was, and I quote, a commonwealth holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery. The servitude of the African to the white race is within our nation's limits. A relation that has existed from the first settlement by the great white race, and which her people, this nation's people, have intended that this relationship should exist for all time. That the African would remain in servitude to the white race. Refusing to sign the Declaration, Sam Houston was denounced as a traitor knave and forced to resign the governorship. The following year, with the Confederate Army desperate for people to join the Army for conscripts, 41 men in Gainesville, Texas, were hung all together on the same day for refusing conscription into the Confederate Army. In a single day, more than 300 children lost their fathers. It was the largest mass hanging in American history. I think about this history I've shared with you, and I'm thinking how much has really changed in our country in 160 years. We're preaching Jesus, who came into the world to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to preach that message, and to have it be a hanging offense. How much has really changed? If there are preachers out there who are really avidly willing to stand up and proclaim to set the oppressed free, and those on the margins to be seen as God's children, every bit as equal as anyone else, and to call for a society that embraces that. If anything, conspiracy theories raging in America in 2020 are actually far more far-fetched than Charles Pryor's nightmare scenario. Conspiracy theories like QAnon and the pandemic denial are typically associated with people who are driven by fear, often coming to believe that their troubles are the work of dark demonic forces, quote unquote, the liberal elite, whatever. But QAnon, birtherism, and the Proud Boys are fantasy worlds constructed for and by white people. They are a sign of desperation to hold on to the white America I guess people still pine for. They are the last vestiges of white supremacy, and its attempt to hold on to whatever power they feel is slipping away. What a sad way to live. The history of our nation has been disfigured by racial inequity and iniquity. That's not my opinion, it is a fact. And it didn't happen by accident. It did not happen by accident. It was fully intentional. If white Christian America cannot reckon with this dismal reality, our flight into fantasy can only accelerate. My hope and my prayer in this Advent season is that we will take time to look each other in the eye, to hear each other's story, to do the best that we can to understand each other's fears and how those fears perhaps can be driving us and perceiving things. But that calls us to be vulnerable with each other. And if you're willing to be vulnerable with someone, it's kind of looking at someone like they're your equal. I think that's the great challenge for a lot of us. That babe in a manger came for us all. God help us to share that gift. The gift of good news. Of that bundle of love. And live it out in our relationships with each other. God help us. Amen.